The day I discovered an entire neighborhood standing on my family's land was the day I learned that concrete can hide a lie, but it can never erase a deed. The smell of wet cedar drifted through the open window of my pickup as I followed the familiar county road toward Hollow Creek Ranch, the same road my grandfather had driven every morning for 40 years before sunrise with a thermos of black coffee balanced beside him. 3 months away overseeing a timber restoration contract in western Montana had felt longer than I expected, and all I wanted was to hear my tires crunch across the old gravel lane that wound between cottonwoods before opening into 800 acres of rolling pasture. Instead, my GPS calmly announced that I had reached my destination while the landscape in front of me looked like something pulled straight from a real estate commercial. Neatly painted sidewalks stretched across what used to be my grazing fields. Rows of identical two-story houses reflected the afternoon sun through spotless windows. Fresh sod glowed an impossible shade of green. Children rode bicycles where my cattle had once gathered around the stock pond. Decorative streetlights lined roads that had never existed when I left. A polished stone monument welcomed visitors to Willow Creek Estates, complete with a bronze HOA emblem mounted so proudly it almost made me wonder if I had taken a wrong turn. Then I noticed something impossible. The ridge behind those houses was unmistakable. The twisted oak my father had refused to cut down still leaned against the western skyline exactly where it always had. My ranch hadn't disappeared. Someone had simply built an entire subdivision on top of it. I slowed to a stop, rolled down my window, and listened. Instead of wind moving through tall grass, I heard lawn sprinklers ticking in perfect rhythm. Instead of meadowlarks, I heard the distant hum of pool equipment and leaf blowers. Even the air smelled different. Fresh asphalt mixed with new paint and fertilizer, burying the familiar scent of sagebrush that had defined this place my entire life. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as I pulled toward the only entrance. A black iron gate blocked the road. A security booth stood where our old cattle guard had been. The guard stepped outside wearing a pressed polo shirt with the HOA logo stitched over his chest. He smiled politely until I told him I owned the ranch beyond the gate. His expression barely changed. "Residents only, sir," he said, holding out one hand before pointing toward a visitor parking area. "You'll need approval from the Homeowners Association before entering." For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. I looked past him at the pavement stretching across land my grandfather bought in 1964, at mailboxes planted where fence posts used to stand, and at 60 rooftops rising above fields that still existed on every survey map locked inside my office safe. Before I could answer, a white luxury SUV rolled through the gate without stopping. The driver glanced at me with the casual confidence of someone who believed she belonged there. At that exact moment, I realized I wasn't looking at a construction mistake. I was looking at a finished community that had somehow convinced the entire county that I was the outsider standing on my own ranch. My name is Grant Holloway, and if there is one thing you should know about me, it is that I do not inherit land simply to own it. I inherit responsibility. My grandfather bought Hollow Creek Ranch in the spring of 1964 after returning from years of working logging camps across the Pacific Northwest. He paid cash for the first 200 acres, then spent the next 3 decades buying neighboring parcels whenever another rancher retired. By the time he handed the property to my father, the ranch had grown into more than 800 acres of pasture, timber, and rolling hills connected by one winding dirt road that crossed a narrow canyon before reaching the county highway. That road never looked impressive. It was dusty in July, muddy every March, and rough enough to shake loose every tool sitting in the bed of a pickup truck. But my grandfather always smiled whenever someone complained about it. He used to tap the dashboard and say, "Fancy roads belong to people who have to ask permission. This one belongs to us." As a kid, I thought he was only talking about gravel. Years later, I realized he was talking about freedom. I never became a rancher full-time. Instead, I built a timber restoration company that specialized in recovering forests damaged by wildfire and disease. The work kept me traveling across the West, helping counties restore public land while the ranch continued operating through trusted employees who had worked with our family for years. Every contract I accepted had one condition. No matter where the job took me, Hollow Creek Ranch always remained home. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every branding season, I came back because some places become part of your identity long before you understand their value. My office still smelled like pine boards my father installed with his own hands. His old leather gloves still rested on a shelf beside survey maps rolled into faded cardboard tubes. He believed paperwork mattered just as much as fences because fences could rot, while records lasted generations. I remembered laughing at him once when he insisted on making duplicate copies of every property document. He only smiled and told me that land disputes were usually won years before anyone stepped inside a courtroom. Standing outside that iron gate, those words echoed louder than the voices drifting from neighborhood sidewalks behind it. Families pushed strollers across concrete, poured over ground where I learned to ride horses. Decorative flower beds covered the exact slope where my father taught me how rainwater naturally drained into the creek after every spring storm. None of those people looked nervous. They looked comfortable, safe, completely convinced they belonged there. That realization unsettled me more than the gate itself, because confidence like that does not appear overnight. Somebody had spent months, maybe years, telling everyone this place belonged to the homeowners association. As I reached into the glove compartment and wrapped my hand around the worn brass key to my father's office, I had the strange feeling that whatever answers existed were not waiting behind the gate. They were waiting inside the old ranch house, exactly where my father always insisted the truth should stay until someone needed it most. I drove around the subdivision instead of arguing with the guard because I wanted answers more than I wanted satisfaction. Every turn revealed another piece of a puzzle that made less sense the longer I looked at it. Brand new sidewalks curved around ponds that used to collect spring runoff for my cattle. Decorative fences stood exactly where our old boundary markers should have been. Street signs carried cheerful names like Meadow View Lane and Canyon Breeze Court, names invented by people who had clearly never spent a winter digging frozen water lines out of this soil. Then I found the sales office. It occupied a polished stone building where my equipment barn had once stood. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the lobby as smiling employees greeted potential buyers beneath oversized photographs of sunsets taken from my own ridge. Behind the reception desk hung a framed slogan that read, "Building tomorrow on trusted ground." I almost laughed at the irony. Before I could introduce myself, a woman stepped through a glass doorway with the calm confidence of someone who expected every room to belong to her. She wore an immaculate cream-colored blazer despite the dusty afternoon, and not a single strand of her perfectly styled blonde hair seemed willing to move in the Wyoming breeze. "You must be Mr. Holloway," she said before I ever offered my name. Her voice was smooth, practiced, and carried the kind of friendliness that never quite reached her eyes. "I am Victoria Ellington, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association." She extended her hand as though we were meeting for lunch instead of standing on land my family had owned for generations. I accepted the handshake because my father always believed courtesy revealed more than anger ever could. "You built all of this on my ranch," I said quietly. She smiled without hesitation. "According to our records, this community was legally developed through the appropriate channels." Then she motioned toward a conference room where architectural renderings covered the walls. Every display celebrated neighborhood, amenities, property values, and future expansion. Not one mentioned Hollow Creek Ranch. It was as though my family's history had been carefully edited out of existence. Victoria spoke with remarkable certainty, explaining that investors had purchased development rights, county approvals had been secured, and dozens of families had already closed on their homes. Every sentence sounded rehearsed, polished by attorneys and real estate consultants until it carried the weight of absolute confidence. Then she opened a leather folder and slid several papers across the table toward me. The top page was not an apology. It was a lawsuit. According to the filing, I was allegedly interfering with lawful access to private property and making statements that threatened the financial interests of the homeowners association. My own name appeared beneath the words defendant in bold black letters. The faint scent of fresh printer ink mixed with expensive perfume as I stared at the documents. And for the first time that afternoon, I understood the scale of what had happened. They had not accidentally wandered onto my ranch. They believed they had already won. Victoria folded her hands neatly on the table and offered one final smile. "I strongly recommend you speak with your attorney before creating unnecessary complications for 60 innocent homeowners." I looked through the conference room window toward the narrow canyon beyond the subdivision where the old ranch road disappeared between two sandstone cliffs, and something deep in my memory stirred. My grandfather had once called that road the most valuable acre on the entire property. At the time, I thought he was exaggerating. Standing there with a lawsuit in my hands, I began to wonder if he had been trying to teach me something I had only just become ready to understand. The lawsuit sat on the passenger seat beside me all the way back to the ranch house, its crisp pages sliding across the leather every time I rounded a curve. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the empty pasture, and for the first time in my life the place felt strangely quiet. Even the wind seemed different, carrying faint echoes of lawn, mowers and garage doors from the subdivision instead of cattle and meadow birds. I unlocked the old ranch house, and the familiar scent of aged pine, machine oil, and worn leather settled my thoughts almost instantly. Nothing inside had changed. My father's boots still rested beneath the coat rack. His coffee mug remained beside the kitchen window exactly where he had left it years ago. Outside, however, someone had rewritten history. I spread the lawsuit across the dining room table beside several county maps and began making phone calls. My first attorney sounded confident for less than 5 minutes. The moment he heard how many homes had already been completed and how many families had purchased property, his voice changed. He warned me that judges disliked disrupting occupied neighborhoods. He talked about complicated litigation, political pressure, developer financing, and years of expensive court battles. By the end of the conversation, he was discussing settlement options instead of ownership. After hanging up, I called the county planning office hoping for clarity. The clerk politely confirmed that permits had been issued through normal administrative channels and suggested I direct any concerns through the pending lawsuit. Even the sheriff's office responded carefully when I asked whether I could simply drive onto my own land. The deputy explained that because legal ownership was actively disputed, everyone wanted the court to determine the outcome before taking enforcement action. Every conversation ended the same way. Wait. Hire lawyers. Let the process unfold. I stared through the window toward the narrow canyon where the old ranch road disappeared beyond a line of cottonwoods. My grandfather used to tell me that patience and surrender were two completely different things, and most people confuse them. I was beginning to understand exactly what he meant. As dusk settled across the property, lights flickered on throughout the subdivision. 60 front porches glowed like tiny lanterns across ground that still existed in every memory I had ever carried. Families gathered for dinner. Dogs barked behind freshly painted fences. Delivery vans rolled through streets that had not existed a season earlier. Nobody inside those homes appeared worried because they believed every permit, every closing document, and every smiling promise made by the homeowners association had erased everything that came before. Yet something continued bothering me. During my meeting with Victoria, she never once mentioned how people actually entered or left the neighborhood. She talked endlessly about property values, amenities, and future expansion, but never about access. That omission lingered in my mind as I walked into my father's office after dark. Moonlight spilled across shelves packed with weathered binders, rolled surveys, engineering drawings, and faded county plats collected over decades. My father organized everything with almost obsessive precision because he believed forgotten details eventually became valuable. I ran my hand across one dusty cardboard tube labeled simply Original Access Records, and a quiet feeling settled over me. The answers I needed were no longer outside the gate. They were somewhere inside this room, waiting patiently for someone willing to keep looking long after everyone else believed the story had already been finished. The cardboard tube released a faint smell of old paper and dust the moment I pulled the yellowed documents onto my father's desk. Every page had been folded and unfolded so many times that the edges felt as soft as fabric. Survey maps from the 1960s lay beside engineering sketches, handwritten notes, and county correspondence stamped with dates decades older than I was. My father had labeled everything with neat block letters, and one folder immediately caught my attention. It read, Primary Access Easement. I carefully opened it and found an original survey showing the ranch exactly as my grandfather had purchased it. Every fence line matched the memories in my head. Every creek, every hill, every property marker sat exactly where it belonged. Then I noticed something highlighted in red pencil. a narrow strip of land, only 60 feet wide, stretched from the county highway through the canyon before reaching the open valley beyond. It was the same dirt road my family had used for generations. Attached to the survey was an easement agreement recorded nearly 70 years earlier. The language was straightforward. That roadway remained private property owned exclusively by Hollow Creek Ranch unless the owner voluntarily granted legal access through written agreement. I read the paragraph again, then a third time. There was no signed transfer, no amendment, no permanent dedication to public use. I reached for another binder containing newer county plats and spread them across the desk beside the original survey. My pulse quickened as the pieces slowly aligned. Willow Creek Estates occupied the valley beyond the canyon exactly as the promotional maps advertised, but every single street inside the development ultimately connected to only one entrance. That entrance crossed my family's 60-foot access corridor. There was no secondary exit, no emergency bypass, no alternate public road leading to the highway. I walked to the office window and stared toward the dark outline of the canyon beneath the moonlight. Suddenly, my grandfather's favorite saying made perfect sense. The most valuable acre had never been the pasture or the timber. It had always been the road because every possibility beyond the canyon depended on it. I spent the next morning driving every surrounding county road with fresh survey maps spread across the passenger seat. Mile after mile confirmed what the documents already suggested. Steep rock formations bordered one side of the subdivision, while protected wetlands limited construction on the other. The remaining property lines belonged to neighboring ranches that had never granted access either. By lunchtime, I had stopped counting because the conclusion was unavoidable. Every resident, every school bus, every delivery truck, every utility contractor, and every emergency vehicle entered through land my family still legally owned. Yet nobody inside the homeowners association seemed concerned about that fact. They had built an entire community as though the most important piece of infrastructure did not exist. I folded the original easement back into its protective sleeve with far greater care than before. For the first time since returning home, I was no longer overwhelmed by confusion. I was curious. Somewhere between the planning meetings, permit approvals, construction schedules, and property closings, dozens of experienced professionals had either overlooked one extraordinary detail or assumed nobody would ever question it. I still did not know which explanation was true, but I knew exactly what my next step had to be. Before speaking to another attorney or responding to a single page of that lawsuit, I needed one thing that no conversation could replace. I needed the county surveyor to stand on that road with me and tell me, in writing, where the property line had always been. 2 days later, the county surveyor met me just after sunrise at the entrance to the canyon. The morning air carried the sharp scent of damp sage and freshly cut grass drifting from the subdivision, while a thin layer of fog still rested over the creek below. He arrived in a white pickup loaded with tripods, measuring equipment, and weathered binders that looked almost as old as the ones sitting in my father's office. We exchanged a few quiet words before getting to work. Neither of us needed small talk. The documents would answer every question that mattered. For the next several hours, he compared the original deeds, verified the monument markers buried decades earlier, and checked every measurement against the county records. I watched him brush dirt away from an old brass survey cap that my grandfather had once shown me when I was a boy. It had not moved an inch. Neither had the legal boundary attached to it. By late morning, the surveyor folded his maps, looked directly at me, and nodded. The access corridor remained exactly where it had always been. The county records still identified Hollow Creek Ranch as the owner. No document in his possession transferred that roadway to the homeowners association, the developer, or the public. He promised to issue a formal written certification before the end of the week. That single statement changed everything. I thanked him, slipped the original easement back into its protective folder, and drove into town without making a single stop at the subdivision. I was no longer interested in arguments. I wanted facts collected with the same patience my father had spent a lifetime practicing. Over the next several days, I hired an independent engineering firm to review the subdivision plans together with the certified survey. Their conclusion matched what I had already suspected. Every internal street eventually converged at the same private access corridor crossing my property. The engineers also confirmed that emergency access, utility maintenance, school transportation, waste collection, package delivery, and routine public services all relied on that single connection. There was no practical secondary route meeting county standards. The realization was almost surreal. Dozens of professionals had designed, approved, financed, marketed, and purchased an entire neighborhood while treating the most essential piece of infrastructure as though it belonged to someone else by default. I never celebrated the discovery because I understood what it meant for the families living there. Most of them had probably acted in good faith, trusting paperwork placed in front of them at closing. My disagreement was never with the homeowners. It was with the people who assured them every legal question had already been answered. When the surveyor emailed the signed certification 3 days later, I printed 3 copies and placed one beside my grandfather's original deed. The 2 documents, separated by nearly 70 years, fit together like matching pieces of the same story. The old papers explained why the road existed. The new certification confirmed that nothing had legally changed. As the afternoon sun reflected across the stack of maps covering my dining room table, I realized I finally possessed something stronger than frustration or suspicion. I possessed a complete chain of documented ownership supported by current measurements and official records. For the first time since returning home, I could see the path ahead with absolute clarity. I would not answer accusations with anger or headlines. I would answer them with certified evidence, careful preparation, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing the ground beneath your feet has been telling the same truth for generations. Once the paperwork was complete, I stopped thinking like someone defending property and started thinking like someone preparing a case that could survive every question a courtroom might ask. My father always believed the strongest legal position was the one that never relied on emotion, so I followed his example. Every morning, I organized another binder. Certified surveys went into one, original deeds into another, county correspondence, engineering reports, historical aerial photographs, tax records, and maintenance logs each received their own labeled section. By the end of the week, the dining room table looked less like a home and more like a land records archive. The quiet rustle of paper had replaced every angry conversation I could have wasted my time having. I also hired a land use attorney whose first reaction was completely different from the others I had spoken with. Instead of focusing on the 60 completed homes, he spent nearly an hour studying the certified survey before leaning back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. He finally looked at me and said, "The most important document in this entire dispute is not the lawsuit. It is the access corridor." Those words confirmed everything I had begun to suspect. Together we reviewed every applicable county regulation concerning private roads, recorded easements, emergency access requirements, and property ownership. We were careful not to make assumptions. Every statement had to be supported by official documentation. Every conclusion had to match the public record. My attorney insisted that patience would matter just as much as preparation because any unnecessary confrontation could distract from the facts. I agreed completely. We drafted a formal notice addressed to the Homeowners Association, not as a threat, but as a clear legal communication. The letter acknowledged the certified survey, referenced the recorded ownership documents, and requested immediate discussions regarding the continued use of the privately owned access corridor. It also established a reasonable deadline for a response. The notice explained that no permanent easement had ever been granted and that continued access required a lawful resolution consistent with the recorded property rights. We delivered the documents through certified mail and confirmed receipt. Then we waited. The response arrived 4 days later. It was remarkably short. Victoria's attorneys dismissed our findings, claimed the subdivision had been developed through valid approvals, and insisted their clients intended to continue using the roadway without interruption. There was no request to review the survey, no interest in comparing records, no proposal for negotiation. They acted as though confidence alone could outweigh generations of documented ownership. My attorney quietly placed the letter back into its folder and simply said, "Now we follow the process." Over the following week, we filed additional documentation with the county, so every current survey, ownership certification, and historical record appeared together in the official property file. We also notified the appropriate public agencies that questions regarding access were being resolved through established legal procedures. Every step happened openly, professionally, and exactly as required. There were no dramatic confrontations at the subdivision entrance and no emotional speeches. While the homeowners association continued operating as though nothing had changed, we quietly assembled a foundation that rested entirely on verified facts. Each signed document, each certified map, and each recorded filing brought us one step closer to the moment when the legal reality beneath that neighborhood would become impossible for anyone to ignore. The deadline outlined in our notice expired without any meaningful response, so my attorney filed the next series of documents exactly as planned. Every filing relied on the same certified surveys, recorded deeds, and county records that had already been verified. Nothing was exaggerated because nothing needed to be. A few days later, the county acknowledged the updated property documentation, confirming once again that the private access corridor remained under the ownership of Hollow Creek Ranch. With every legal requirement satisfied, I authorized a licensed contractor to install a new ranch gate precisely along the surveyed boundary line. It was not an oversized structure or a dramatic statement. It was a solid steel gate built exactly where generations of survey markers said my property began. Beside it stood a simple sign with clean black lettering that read, "Private Ranch Access. Entry by permission only." Watching the crew measure every post against the certified survey felt strangely peaceful. The metallic sound of wrenches tightening bolts echoed through the canyon, while the familiar smell of dry earth rose beneath their boots. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. Every movement followed the approved site plan prepared by the surveyor. Once the installation was complete, my attorney immediately notified the homeowners association, county officials, emergency service coordinators, utility providers, and every appropriate agency that access to the private corridor would now require a lawful agreement with the property owner. The notice specifically explained that emergency coordination would continue through established legal procedures while the ownership dispute proceeded, ensuring public safety remained protected. By the following morning, the effect became impossible to ignore. Delivery trucks slowed to a stop outside the new gate before turning around after speaking with dispatch. A school transportation supervisor arrived carrying maps and spent nearly an hour reviewing alternate routes that simply did not exist. Utility contractors checked their paperwork several times before making phone calls from inside their vehicles. Even residents leaving for work paused at the entrance, confused by the new sign and the survey stakes marking the edge of the private corridor. None of them appeared angry at first. Most simply looked surprised, as though they had encountered a piece of history nobody had ever mentioned during the purchase of their homes. Around mid-morning, Victoria arrived in the same white sport utility vehicle I had seen on my first day back. She stepped out with two attorneys carrying thick folders and walked directly toward the gate. This time there were no confident smiles and no rehearsed speeches about property values. One attorney politely requested permission to discuss temporary access arrangements while negotiations continued. My attorney, standing beside me with the complete chain of ownership documents, calmly explained that we remained willing to negotiate a lawful recorded easement under mutually acceptable terms, exactly as we had requested weeks earlier. The difference was that now every conversation began with the certified recognition that the roadway belonged to Hollow Creek Ranch. Throughout the afternoon, more residents gathered near the entrance asking questions that deserved honest answers. Many admitted they had assumed the road was public because that was what they had been led to believe. I understood their frustration because they had trusted professionals to verify details that should never have been overlooked. As the sun settled behind the canyon walls, casting long golden light across the steel gate, I realized the quiet dirt road my grandfather treasured had finally revealed its true value. It had never been the shortest path to the highway. It had always been the one fact that every blueprint, every sales brochure, and every lawsuit had depended upon from the very beginning. The formal negotiations began less than a week later inside the same county administration building where so many permits had once been approved without anyone asking the question that ultimately mattered. This time, every seat around the conference table was occupied. Representatives from the homeowners association, attorneys, county officials, engineers, title specialists, and insurance advisors all had copies of the same certified surveys spread out before them. The room was remarkably quiet because there was very little left to debate. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. Hollow Creek Ranch had never transferred ownership of the access corridor. The recorded chain of title was complete, uninterrupted, and fully supported by current surveys. Victoria no longer carried the confidence she had displayed during our first meeting. She spoke professionally, acknowledged the documentation, and admitted that the homeowners needed a permanent legal solution rather than another round of expensive litigation. My attorney presented a straightforward proposal. The Homeowners Association could purchase a recorded easement under fair market terms, reimburse the documented legal and survey expenses required to resolve the dispute, and update every public record so future buyers would receive complete and accurate information about the property. The county officials agreed that correcting the records served everyone's interests, especially the families already living in the neighborhood. After several hours of careful discussion, the agreement was finalized. The Homeowners Association accepted the easement, agreed to revise its governing documents, and committed to providing transparent disclosures in future property transactions. Once every signature had been placed on the final pages, I authorized the permanent access agreement exactly as promised. A few days later, I returned to the canyon just after sunrise. The morning air carried the familiar scent of sagebrush again, mixed with fresh mountain air drifting through the cottonwoods. I unlocked the steel gate and watched workers replace the temporary notice with a permanent easement marker referencing the newly recorded agreement. It was a simple sign, but unlike everything that had come before it, every word on it matched the public record. Residents drove through on their morning commute without interruption, many offering a friendly wave after learning the full story from the public county meeting. Several homeowners even stopped by the ranch over the following weeks to introduce themselves. They were surprised to discover that the person they had been told was creating unnecessary problems had spent the entire dispute protecting the legal certainty that ultimately safeguarded their own investments as well. One family brought homemade pie. Another asked if their children could help feed the horses one weekend. Those moments reminded me that communities are built by neighbors, not by paperwork alone. Before leaving that morning, I walked over to the weathered wooden sign my grandfather had carved decades earlier. Time had faded the paint, but the lettering was still easy to read. I cleaned away the dust, straightened it beside the entrance road, and stepped back. The ranch looked exactly as it should have all along. The houses remained beyond the canyon. Families continued living their lives, and the roadway connected both places through an agreement based on honesty instead of assumptions. As the first rays of sunlight stretched across the gravel, I finally understood the lesson my father and grandfather had spent years trying to teach me. Land is valuable, but truth is what protects it. Quiet preparation will outlast loud confidence every single time, because justice does not arrive through anger or revenge. It arrives one verified document, one careful decision, and one undeniable fact at a time.